Hey, and welcome to the channel where our storied tradition of time-lapse footage while putting something together means we're doing a new gear review. Today, we're featuring the Trak Racer TR8 sim racing cockpit. The TR8 is a very impressive looking bit of kit, largely consisting of 2-inch powder-coated steel tubing. It comes pre-packaged as 4 main components: the seat base, the pedal plate base, and the wheel plate base. I also opted for the optional casters and larger shifter plate. The core of the unit is very quick to bolt together, as the bolts are already pre-inserted in all the relevant positions. They also have fastening clamps which go over the joints in order to aid in core rigidity. I was told by Trak Racer that it was designed specifically to handle the most rigorous direct drive applications and load cell pedal kits requiring substantial forces. That's to say, it's been designed to avoid flexing. The setup was very straightforward until we got to the shifter plate. We had a mishap where we confused the smaller plate with the larger one and went back and forth a few times until deciding which one to actually bolt on. After quickly trying the stock plate which comes with the unit, we opted to take it down and use the larger add-on. I'll talk about the reasons why during our test drive. Overall, the process of putting the bulk of the unit together took about an hour. Bolting the pedals and DD1 on while adjusting the spacings and orientation of everything to suit my body took about another hour. The unit has the standard array of adjustments such as limited height and orientation for the wheel plate, sliding adjustment as well as an array of angling positions for the pedal plate, and 3 different bolt positions, front and rear for the seat in order to adjust height and angle with a standard rail system for front to back sliding. The completed unit is, in my opinion, one of the best looking packages you can get for sim racing. Sleek, understated, and very, very black. And just like that, we're sitting in the completed rig. Those of you who followed the channel for the last few days have probably realized that I've actually been using this thing for several days, if not a couple of weeks now. The reasoning behind that has been to use it as my main and give you a real world impression rather than just a couple of hours test to give you just the cursory impressions. So for the sake of this driving test, we'll be doing 2 main conditions. The first of which is going to be an old school manual style driving test that's going to put a lot of load onto the cockpit, all 3 pedals, heel and toe, H-pattern shifting, maybe the handbrake as well. And the second test is going to be the more common GT3 style driving, so just 2 pedals, more of a GT style rim, and something that's going to load the cockpit less, but probably highlight more of the finer details that we may get due to its flex or lack thereof. So I'll be going over the positives and the negatives over the course of these driving tests as they come up, but I'll be probably disproportionately focusing on the positives and the way that the cockpit feels. In our recap, which is going to come after the driving test, I'll be highlighting both the positives and the negatives of the cockpit, so stay tuned for that to get an overall impression. We're of course starting in BeamNG, one of my favorite sims in recent times, as I'm sure you guys would have realized. So what we're driving here is one of my favorite hill climbs on Jungle Rock Island. It is about a 3 to 4 minute hill climb. We're driving one of the amalgam European cars, so like a Merc, Audi, BMW sort of jammed together into one Group AS kind of platform from the late 80s, early 90s. That's going to give us a lot of sideways and a lot of shifting and a lot of a good platform to actually test the H-pattern experience on this cockpit, so let's do it. Alright, here we go. As you can tell, ton of turbo lag, but that's part of what makes this car so exciting. It's so very old school in its delivery. So the first thing that you hit with using this cockpit is the fact that the self-aligning torque forces, you can just let the wheel go and it does its own thing. The cockpit doesn't impede the motion of the wheel. The flex doesn't eat up the detail. So one of the first things I realized with this cockpit was that I was just getting way more micro detail for a given setting. And this applied across the board. It happened in BeamNG, which kind of has a more, I don't know, you might call it a bit of a spotty force feedback engine maybe. It's turned it into one that's actually quite engaging, as you can see. See, I can just do my thing, right? So let's do this again. Another gear down. You just let it realign, and it's honestly, it's so similar to the real life BMW that it's insane. I mean, I've done this on my road car a couple of times. Just let the wheel go, let it align itself, and catch and go. It facilitates you being able to drive this in a way that's so similar to a real car that you can't help but just smile. Oh man. Alrighty, cool. I'm having too much fun already. So that aside, alright, so quite rigid for a cockpit of this nature. Not completely flexless, mind you. I've blown this up in 4K, so if you've got a large TV, you can watch it for yourself. You will see movements in the plate, right? It's not completely flexless, but it's devoid of flex enough that you don't feel like it's kind of hampering the experience in any meaningful way. Sorry, I'm having too much fun here. I'm definitely not going for lap times. It's more of a kind of casual time trial, if you will. So, that said, you've probably noticed that my heel and towing has been relatively on point, and that's partly because this has allowed me to position my Heusinkveld Sprint Pedals in such a way that just feels so intuitive and is so easy to get from one pedal to another. So the pedal plate I'm supremely happy with, allows you to make all the adjustments that you might want, so you can basically I think you can adjust the height, but I think more than anything it's about the angling. I've set it completely flat because that's the way I prefer to drive, and as you can tell, it's just given me enough to drive a car with no assists whatsoever. Did I just... Okay, cool, that was the turbo. I thought I got a flat tire there. It's usually not a good time. But yes, see, the heel and toe is super easy. Even on a car like this that just chews through the gears. So fun. I never miss the blip on this. It's so easy. And that being said, I mean, that about rounds out the positives. Obviously, the other thing is that the cockpit itself, maybe you won't be able to see too much from this angle here, but it, in my opinion, looks fantastic. I think it looks very sleek, it looks very understated and elegant, very, you can have any color you want so long as it's black kind of thing, you know, because you can probably tell by the room that I set up here, I'm a big fan of the understated black. It's just a really nice, sleek design. More than anything, it feels a little bit more bespoke and purpose-built than the last cockpit I was using, so I really do appreciate that. Now, before we get to the end, because we are coming up to the end of this track, and it's funny how quickly the time flies when I'm just ranting at you, let's talk about one of the small negatives. You've probably noticed that the shifter plate is in a bit of a strange position. You're noticing that I'm actually reaching forward past the wheel in order to grab it and move it around. This leads to a problem because there's constantly a strain on my front delt and I'm finding myself a bit fatigued going for the shifter. I often find myself missing the shift into third, so I'll tend to go into like first or fifth by accident because I'm having to reach and push so far forward. It's a very unnatural position for a H-pattern shifter to sit if you're used to driving H-pattern in real life. So that's not completely ideal. The fact that the handbrake is mounted here, so I have to actually reach over. It's not immediately there. It's just like I have to actually kind of contort and move my body in order to actually get it across. So a little bit laborsome when it comes to the shifter plate, and as I said in the setup video, this is the aftermarket plate as well, so a lot less flex than you would get from the stock one. That being said, it is a little bit awkwardly positioned, at least for Fanatec gear. You may have more luck using Thrustmaster or Logitech shifters, but probably just worth noting before we move on. And now for the more purposeful part of our test. We're here with our McLaren GT rim in a Assetto Corsa Competizione in a GT3 car, kind of going over the experience that most people will be having online racing against one another. So the onus is on the integrity of the wheel plate, the integrity of the actual base plate, and just the general overall rigidity and comfort of the cockpit over the course of one of these laps. So let's try it out and see how we go. We're of course role-playing as our man James Baldwin here at Silverstone, the 720S. A combo I know reasonably well, even though the fact that Silverstone is possibly my worst track in all of racing. For some reason, it's one of those ones I just never gelled with, but here we are. Makes it a really good test for this kind of thing. So, the moment I bolted the DD1 onto this wheel plate and I tested it out in ACC, the first thing I felt was yet more micro detail than what I was used to, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because every little incremental improvement to my gear in ACC has just made that much difference. So it's a funny platform to test this kind of stuff on. Let's try and work out what I'm doing here. Oh, It's, this is not your time, Ermin. So in fact, I got so much extra detail that I found myself clicking up the interpolation filter an extra notch, which is a good sign because you can always dial down excessive detail, but you can never really get it if it's not there in the first place. So it kind of goes to show how structurally rigid the actual wheel plate itself is, including the columns which feed it. Much the same thing with the pedal plate, so it feels supremely rigid to me. As I said, I don't have to use the Heusinkveld one anymore as a compatibility proxy. It's literally each pedal is bolted directly onto the wheel plate of the Trak Racer, of the TR8, and it just feels superb. I have complete control over the throttle and the braking, notwithstanding my bad driving ability getting in the way, but you know, had I been good at this, I would be really, you know, having a good time with it. So that's the core of it. It feels very, very good. The next portion is, of course, the seating position and the seating quality. So the seating position is basically locked into GT mode, which for someone like myself is completely fine. It's what I've come to be used to, it's what I've come to expect. And the seat itself is very interesting. It's somewhat buckety in nature because if you have a wider clavicle like myself, you'll find it a little bit constricting around the shoulders. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's actually quite similar to what racy seats will do for you in real life. It's just maybe a little bit less friendly to those carrying a few extra pounds, as the last seat I used might have been. The other thing is that the material doesn't necessarily breathe a lot, so if you're expecting to do a lot of endurance racing for many hours at a time, you'll probably want to be packing very light clothing for that. As I negotiate this very famous complex of corners and get terrible, terrible times. My apologies about that. I'm still not quite at the level where I can race at the absolute pinnacle while trying to give a diatribe and a review about a cockpit. In time, maybe. Ugh, what an experience. But yeah, as you can see, it's put me in a position of control, much as it did in Beam and G, where I feel like any mistake that's made is a result of my own lack of driving ability rather than the cockpit or some detail it's not feeding or some overt flex that I'm experiencing. And especially in this mode, I feel like it's way more at home than the manual style H-pattern driving or the drift style driving. Because it's just the core components that lead to this kind of driving have just been locked down on the TR8. It's just basically flexless as far as the competitive driving experience is concerned. Wheel plate is fantastic. Pedal plate is fantastic. The seat is relatively rigid as well. The whole thing just feels together. You feel like you're actually in the cockpit of a car. And once you do a few laps, you can kind of deceive yourself into thinking that's the experience, which is ultimately what you want out of sim racing. Just to finish, as we did last time, on one of the tiny niggles I have, again it comes up with the shifter plate. So as you can tell, I'm a bit of a taller guy, I'm about 6'3", and my left leg is just resting against the shifter here. That's quite a pathetic lap. So my left leg is consistently kind of smashing against that shifter there. After a while, it begins to feel a bit kind of constricting and claustrophobic, so I would suggest that if you're primarily an open-wheeler, modern GT car style driver, that you don't bolt on a shifter plate whatsoever. Just kind of stick to what the unit excels at and go from there, because you won't kind of run into these constrictions, because I think one of the biggest negatives to the design is probably the location of the shifter plate. Right, and with that we get to the end of our driving test, so let's recap the entire cockpit and get to our conclusion. I'm going to start piece by piece going through every major section of the cockpit as it relates to my experience with it over the last several days. So beginning with the seat. The first sensation you get is that you're quite rigidly comfortable in here. It's quite snug, kind of like a bucket seat. If you have a wider clavicle like myself, it can feel a little bit constricting, but you can kind of manipulate yourself in such a way that it's still comfortable over long periods of time. If you're a larger gent and perhaps, have need of a bit more waist real estate, it may not be the idyllic seat for you, but I would say that you'd have to be relatively overweight for that to start becoming a problem. Beyond that, there's the fact that the material itself is quite snug, it's quite warm, so if you live in a colder climate, you may actually enjoy that. However, it doesn't breathe particularly well, so over long stints, I'm already kind of feeling it get sticky on my lower back, so that's one thing that you want to bear in mind. As we've spoken about, the seat itself has 3 different bolt hole adjustments, front and rear, as well as the standard rail system for going backward and forward, so you can adjust it in relation to the rest of the rig quite comfortably. The wheel plate design and the columns which feed it they look very space age. I love the look of the 2 columns which kind of come up from underneath and are up toward the actual wheelbase to support it. It's a really, really cool aesthetic, and I do visually very much enjoy the TR8. The wheel plate itself for my DD1, I wouldn't say is perfect, as you can see. I'm flexing it ever so slightly just by doing this. I've had to re-tighten many of the bolts on the rig because they were coming loose for about a day or 2. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe it has like a bed-in period, but I would recommend checking them over the first week that you have the unit set up just to make sure that everything is super tight. I've gone through and re-tightened everything about 3 times now, so this kind of flex I think is what's maintained even after the fact, as you can see. Just a tiny, tiny little bit. It's not something you can feel while driving whatsoever. You get a ton of detail, as I was saying, in ACC compared to my last cockpit. I actually had to turn up the interpolation filter to get less of that detail because it was too much. So no complaints in that regard. I think it's a very acceptable level of flex, especially for the price range that it's operating in and for the kind of market that it's targeted toward. Now, talking about the wheel plate, that's probably one of the most impressive aspects for me. Even pushing on it there's very minimal flex, possibly the same amount, if slightly less than my old rig had. I can see it kind of tilting forward a little bit when I push on the brakes, when I give about 80 kilos of pressure on the brake or more. So if you're the kind of person that likes running a full open wheeler load, like you've got high-end load cell pedals that can take 130 kilos of brake pressure or more, it may not be the idyllic unit for you, but if you're using anything more sensible like my Heusinkveld Sprint Pedals, I use about 40 kilos of actuation force to max out the brakes, so not all that much. It's totally serviceable for that. Really, really good. As you saw on the H-pattern style driving with the full 3-pedal use, the heel and toe, it just is completely effortless and so fun and so engaging. So for a unit in this range, it has a great amount of adjustability. The pedal plate itself is relatively rigid. You won't really feel it impeding the driving experience in any meaningful way. With that, of course, it's drilled for most of the major pedals on the market. I mean, just looking at it even there are so many different options of how you can mount these pedals. I can't imagine that it would get in the way, and ultimately, even if you do have something super esoteric, you can always drill into the pedal plate and kind of carve it to your needs. So with that, we get to the portions that I consider to be a little bit negative. As we've spoken about over the driving tests, I think those lie primarily with the shifter plate. So the stock shifter plate I'm not even showing. I don't think it's really worth the time whatsoever. The position of the shifter with the stock plate is just supremely awkward. It's very flexy. It's probably just not worth your time at all. When it comes to the add-on shifter plate, which is what I'm using right here, it's way more rigid than the one that comes with the unit, so I would strongly recommend getting this one if you plan to do any kind of handbraking or H-pattern or sequential style shifting with it. That being said, it's still not ideal. As you can see, the position of the shifter is just kind of strange in relation to any manual car you may have driven. It's not really the position you expect a shifter to be in. And for the Fanatec, because the base of the unit is here, you're kind of lifting your arm much higher than you would like to be in an ideal circumstance. So a bit more adjustability on the shifter would be very well welcome. If you have the shifter plate on the American side, which I guess a lot of you would consider to be the right side, technically it is exactly the right side, you can actually adjust it so it leans towards you a little bit, which may actually help offset some of these issues, which I have with this being mounted completely flat. If you primarily drive H-pattern manual style cars, I may think about your options in this price range. I think this rig is more dedicated towards the open wheeler style, the flappy paddle shifting, the modern GT cars, and less so the stuff that you want to kind of throw around your arms, shifting and yanking sticks all over the place. The other addition that I got with my unit was the attachable casters. The reason I need this is so I can move this unit back into the corner when I'm actually, not sim racing and rather editing videos or doing my audio production stuff, so it needs to be a little bit mobile for me. The problem with the casters is that they don't lock particularly well. Out of the set that I got, only 4 of them have an actual locking mechanism, and that locking mechanism doesn't really work. So this unit will actually as you can see, it jostles around quite a bit. So I've brought this to Trakracer's attention. I'm hoping that they revise the design, or rather just order casters which lock a little bit better. I think if you don't need casters, if you have this unit just kind of resting on the carpet or on the floor, whatever you may have in your space, it has some really nice high friction feet, which would make this not a problem at all. It's only if you need casters that you may want to look into what they're using, because in my case, I think the casters and the shifter plate are probably the two biggest negatives to this unit. As I've spoken about already, I really love the look of this unit. If I were going purely for aesthetics, I think the TR8 would be my #1 option on the entire market. They've done so well with making it look distinctive and marketable, and as somebody that's a business owner, I have a keen eye for that sort of stuff, so I always do respect that kind of hustle. It's going to look really, really good in your sim setup, especially if you're doing a lot of streaming and stuff like that, so a lot of respect for that. When it comes to the core driving experience, I absolutely love it. I think the pedal plate and the wheelbase and the seat are extremely serviceable, if not fantastic, so I've really enjoyed using this over the last several days. As I've mentioned, just a few drawbacks when it comes to manual style driving and the caster design at this point in time. If I had to give this rig an overall rating out of 10, I would probably give it an 8 out of 10. I think if they improve the shifter plate and the casters as spoken about, it would probably be closer to a 9, maybe a 9.5. So very, very high quality unit, very much worth your attention. After having used it for several days, I believe that this cockpit will pair supremely well with the upcoming Fanatec CSL DD, coincidentally, which I have a review sample of waiting in the hallway as the very next review on this channel, so make sure you subscribe to keep up and don't miss that. Moreover, I've organized an affiliate link with Trakracer down below, so if you guys want to pick up a TR8 or anything from the Trakracer ecosystem, you can help support this channel. I'm also trying to negotiate to see whether we can get a viewer's discount. I'm not entirely sure whether or not that's going to happen at the time of recording this, but be sure to check that link all the same, as I'll have it written down there. So wherever you are, I hope you're having a good day, and until the next one, I'll see you guys later.